There was a great hope across England when Henry VIII's legitimate son Edward was born, but his birth and life would be tinged with sadness and tragedy. Shortly after the heir to the throne was born, Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour, died from childbirth-related issues, but it was hoped that Edward VI would reign over England for decades, and that his future children would secure the Tudor throne for centuries. This would not happen, and Edward VI did not really rule in his own right and power, as he would die at such a young age, and it was clear that the king was very sick. It was noted that on the 15th of February 1553 that the king was very ill, as he was feverish, and his elder sister and woman, who would later dethrone his successor, came to see him shortly before he died. But what is the story of the death of Edward VI? Edward was born on the 12th of October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace, and there was a huge degree of celebration across the country. The news of a male heir and son being born was cheered across England, and Henry VIII was ecstatic with the news. In churches, hymns were sung, and in streets bonfires were lit, and there was a huge degree of happiness for the king and Jane Seymour. But Edward VI's mother, Jane, would recover well to begin with, but she fell ill on the 23rd of October 1537, and she would then succumb to postnatal complications. The happiness and joy of Edward VI's birth was dented with the grief for his mother, and the woman who gave birth to the heir. Edward himself was a healthy boy, and his father Henry VIII was very happy, and he was overjoyed. Henry kept a close eye on his upbringing, and he regularly looked after his son and played with him, and Edward was a strong and healthy young boy. He was tall and happy, and there was a belief that he was sickly, but this was not true, and his first few years were very healthy. But when he was 4, he did suffer from quartan fever, or malaria, but this did threaten his life, and Edward did suffer with poor eyesight. However, then Edward did get better, and he was healthy until the final few months of his life, but he was given the best education that his father could find, and Edward himself was highly intelligent. Now, in the eyes of the people of Tudor England, Edward would grow into a brilliant king, and he was given the best start. He would be visited by his half-sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, often, and he would also be close with Henry VIII's sixth wife, Catherine Parr. The other children visited Edward to play, but he was more interested in his schooling, and he was motivated by the fact that he was the heir. It's believed that even as a young boy he knew what would be asked of him, but on the 1st of February 1543, Henry VIII would sign the Treaty of Greenwich, and this was an attempt to bring peace between England and Scotland. But with this it was proposed that Edward, the heir of England, married the 7-month-old Mary, Queen of Scots. The Scots refused this and allied themselves with England's enemies, and the king then rampaged into Scotland and ordered Edward's uncle to invade and burn Edinburgh and to sack the Scottish lands. Edward's father's health was rather poor in the early 1547, and inside of the Palace of Whitehall he died. Edward was just 9 when he was crowned King Edward VI at Westminster Abbey, and a regency council was set up to help him rule, headed up by his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector. There were 16 people who would help the young boy rule, and Edward, being king, was now given the best food in England, and his health was monitored by the best doctors that England had. They checked his temperature daily and worried about his food, and Edward was well fed and was rather tall for his age. It was written how Edward's posture wasn't great, and that he may have had scoliosis of the spine, and he had one shoulder which was lower than the other. In 1550, Edward VI was stricken with a mysterious illness, which was serious, and the royal doctors were concerned, as it looked as if he would not pull through this, but he did recover, and the illness was kept a complete secret. But this was the start of the king's real shift in health. In the spring of 1552, the king contracted another illness, and this was deadly. He caught measles and also smallpox, but he again recovered. He was said to have been wearing glasses at this time, and also he was a little deaf, but in the December of 1552, things were getting much worse for the king's health. He began to show signs of tuberculosis, and the measles infection wreaked havoc with his immune system, and he then caught TB. On the 15th of February 1553, it was said that Edward was sick with a feverish cold, and Mary, his elder sister, came to see him. But during the meeting, he was bedridden, and he had a terrible and violent cough. There were many rumours that the king had been poisoned, but things were kept quiet still. His symptoms were very complicated and diverse, and the best doctors were brought in to treat him, and a mysterious woman said that she could cure the king. She was let into the king's rooms, and Edward VI was given a potion that nearly killed him and caused the king's limbs to swell. But on the 17th of March 1553, things then went very downhill. He may have been a strong boy before, but he was reduced to being a thin and gaunt boy who was stuck in his bed, and the doctors believed he was approaching death. In April of 1553, he did seem to get better, and he went for a walk in a local park, and he was sent to Greenwich to recover, as it was said that the air was better. He was spotted in the garden, and he was getting weaker, but he now was coughing up blood, and this was not good. Edward was still predicted to have made a full recovery, but doctors thought he was suffering from a tumour which was based in his lungs, and that this was causing his high fever. His stomach was also really swollen, and his body broke in sores and ulcers, and the doctors were not happy with this condition. On the 17th of May, the king met with the French ambassadors, and he was very weak, but by the end of the month, Edward was going downhill rapidly. His body became very swollen, and his head and feet were swollen largely, and opiates sent him to sleep. But the changes were then made to his succession. However, on the 10th of June 1553, doctors predicted that Edward had at most 3 days to live, and doctors believed that it was it. He could not eat any food, and he had a fever that did not get better. On the 15th of June, he had another incredibly high fever, and this came back days later, and Edward was now incontinent, and his bowel movements were terribly smelly. His legs continued to swell, and he could only lay on his back, but the young boy's nails and hair were now falling out also, and the last few days were horrific. On the 1st of July, Edward VI was spotted by a crowd at a window, and the king was very sick, but then his final moments would come less than a week later. On the 6th of July 1553, at around 8 or 9 in the evening, Edward VI died in the arms of Sir Henry VIII. His final words were, "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." There were many doctors that were also there, and following his death his surgeon opened up his chest, and it was found that his lungs had 2 ulcers on them, which were infected. Many of Edward VI's symptoms and last moments allude to the fact that he did die from tuberculosis, but a number of historians believe that the contemporary opinions of Edward's deaths was that he died from the disease too, but some claimed he had a pulmonary infection or a lung abscess. However, Edward's death was rather brutal and horrific, and he suffered heavily, but he would be buried on the 8th of August 1553 inside of Westminster Abbey, and he was buried in an unmarked grave inside of the Lady Chapel alongside his grandfather and grandmother, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.